What's up? Welcome back to the Metalhead Car Show. There's a lot of very cool cars out there. What you may gather with these is there's also a lot of weird history and weird facts about these cars. So today I want to go over 20 weird car facts that you may or may not know. We're not going to dawdle, we're going to get right into it. Starting off with McLaren. When Gordon Murray was designing the McLaren F1, he was going back and forth on what engine he actually wanted to use in it. And he was using Porsches, Ferraris, and Lamborghinis as kind of a benchmark towards what he wanted the McLaren F1 to be better than. But one car he chose to add into this was the Honda NSX. He loved the way it drove, he loved the way it felt, and he loved the power delivery from the engine. So Gordon Murray actually tried to employ Honda to build engines for the McLaren F1. What he requested was a 550-ish horsepower V10 or V12 for the car. And Honda declined. They had no interest in doing it and they just would not make the engine for him. So Gordon Murray ended up going to his next pick, which is BMW, asked for the same thing, a 550-ish horsepower V10 or V12. And what BMW brought him was a 627 horsepower, 6.1 liter V12 that we all know and love. But originally, the McLaren F1 was supposed to have a Honda engine. Next up, the Corvette. Now, in 1984, Chevy brought out the C4 Corvette as this new, almost futuristic, modern Corvette for the world. And a lot of people always kind of assume that the C4 Corvette was supposed to come out in 1984 because 4. But in reality, the C4 Corvette was actually supposed to come out in 1983. What happened was GM had the C3 Corvette planned to end production in 1982 and the C4 Corvette to start production in 1983. They actually went and built a pile of Corvettes to get production actually going, but in 1983 a lot of the emissions rules were changed and they couldn't actually use any of the cars they made to be 1983 C4 Corvettes. So unfortunately, they were all destroyed. Every single one was crushed, except one. At the end of the day, the machines were shut off, everyone went home, but there was still one car to crush. So you either turn everything back on and crush the car when you're legally not supposed to, or you come back the next day, fire everything up to do one car. Well, the guy who was actually in charge of crushing all these Corvettes took that one home, hid the car, claimed it was crushed, and just couldn't bring himself to destroy this 1983 Corvette. So there's actually one 1983 C4 Corvette in existence. Corvette owners, that's a one-of-one car. Yours isn't. Next up, Ferrari. Now, one of Ferrari's kind of super special party pieces in their lineup is the F cars, the anniversary cars. Now, in 1987, Ferrari made the Ferrari F40 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Ferrari, and it stands as one of the fan favorites. Now, obviously, they want to do this again for the 50th anniversary. So in 1995, they made the Ferrari F50 to celebrate the 50th anniversary on the 48th anniversary of Ferrari. Kind of weird. But in 2002, Ferrari released the Enzo, which is originally called the F60, and it was released in 2002 celebrating, well, kind of nothing. And again, in 2013, Ferrari released the LaFerrari, which is never called the F70, celebrating kind of nothing as well. So despite these are all the anniversary cars, all the special cars, the F40 is the only real anniversary car. Next up, Mercedes. So in the mid-1930s, Mercedes was starting to notice a lot of the British manufacturers and American manufacturers take their cars to the Bonneville Salt Flats and set land speed records. And around then, the fastest car ever recorded did 163 miles per hour. So Mercedes wanted to crush this and build something that just annihilated every single attempt that has ever been and likely will ever be for a long time. So they started making the T80. The T80 was a super slippery car that used a 44.5 liter V12, making 3,000 horsepower and an extremely debated goal of either 300 miles per hour or 470 miles per hour. That's a huge difference. So this now being the mid to late 1930s, Hitler actually greenlit the project and built Mercedes a 12-kilometer stretch of road so Mercedes could actually test this thing on German soil. The engine was done, the chassis was made, the body was made, and right when Mercedes was gonna go test this, Germany invaded Poland, meaning all funding for the project was gone, and this car was scrapped. It wasn't until the end of the Second World War where the English actually found the T80 body sitting in a shed somewhere, and it didn't have an engine in it. The engine likely went to an airplane, since that's kind of where it came from in the first place. They need to use kind of anything they could for that. So since that was a priority, they'd probably pull the engine and use that for that. But the chassis still exists and the body is actually on display at the Mercedes Museum right now. Next up, Ford. Now, one engine Ford used to use a fair bit was the 6-liter V10 in the Ford F-Series and E-Series. But one thing not that many people know is Ford is actually working on a V10 program for like 10 years. The earliest car for this, which we've actually done a video on, was the Boss 351 Mustang, and it used a 5.8-liter all-aluminum V10. It made a naturally aspirated 450-ish horsepower. It sounded amazing, did great burnouts, but they never built that car. They just said that Mustang was always a mule car for something better. A couple years later, we now start seeing Ford bring out a pile of V10 prototypes. There's the F350 Super Chief, the Ford 427, the V10 Shelby Cobra, and the Shelby Daytona Coupe. That's not what it's called, but it's a Daytona Coupe. And all these cars use variations of like a 7-liter V10. The Super Chief actually getting a supercharger though. But the Super Chief never happened. The 427 turned into the Fusion, and the 2 Shelby cars, despite they could have, also didn't happen. The last thing I ever heard about this V10 program was around 2010, where Ford is actually quietly working on what was going to be a Gen 2 Ford GT, and it was going to use the V10. But much like everything else, that was scrapped, and we ended up getting the awesome twin-turbo V6 GT we currently have. But for about 10 years, Ford was working on a performance-based V10 program. Next up, Bentley. Now, I think every single car person is aware of the Sultan of Brunei. The Sultan of Brunei has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars having special one-off cars built for him by manufacturers. Now, despite it's pretty well known that he's let a lot of cars just kind of rot and mold away in jungles, he has kept a lot of 1990s supercar manufacturers going by him not just buying cars, but also him spending a lot of money on special cars. And with Bentley, he commissioned Bentley to make him 6 SUVs. Now, this is long before the Bentayga, so Bentley made 6 SUVs on Range Rover platforms, and they called them the Bentley Dominator. Full Bentley interior, full Bentley styling, and it had a Bentley 6.75-liter V8 instead of the Rover V8. He spent $40 million commissioning Bentley to make 6, so they are roughly like $6.5 million each, and they are not worth that now, and you'll never see one on the road. Nonetheless, they are super cool. Next up, the Camaro. This is the crazy one, but wanted to add it in. So 1964, Ford officially brought out the Ford Mustang to the world, and it sold unbelievably well. So Chevy, seeing Ford take up a market that A, didn't really exist, but also doing really well at it, Chevy wanted to come out with something to compete. So like late 1966, Chevy had the Camaro, which was made purely to compete with the Mustang. Next up, Lotus. So in the early 1990s, GM more or less gave Lotus a chassis from Vauxhall to go make a sedan out. Lotus only making small sports cars, they were in a kind of a niche market, so having something a bit bigger, a bit more accessible to everybody would be a good idea long term. So Lotus made the Lotus Carlton, a 375 horsepower twin turbo V6 sedan built by Lotus. It's not just it was built by Lotus and it's going to handle well, but it made more power than almost any Ferrari being made and almost every Porsche being made. This thing was fast. It became very popular with UK bank robbers because there is now this car that would seat 4 or 5 people, and that was way faster than the police cars, and so they could just get away and the cops didn't have a hope in hell of catching them. So the UK cops actually wanted to ban the Lotus Carlton from sales purely because they couldn't keep up. And it's becoming such a popular car with bank robberies that people who did this always bought Lotuses. Super cool bit of advertisement right there. The Carlton was eventually dropped, but they didn't ban sales, and it went down as probably one of the coolest Lotuses in history. And it's also the 3rd most powerful drivetrain Lotus has ever used, next to the supercharged Evora V6 and the new EV SUV, whatever they're making. Next up, the Toyota Serra. Now, the Serra is kind of a cool car. It's a small little hatchback that we've actually discussed as one of the cheapest cars you can buy that have vertical doors. But also, the small little hatchback had vertical doors. Completely unnecessary thing, but Toyota decided to give this car butterfly doors. And someone who actually was very inspired by this was Gordon Murray. Gordon Murray saw the Toyota Serra with these butterfly doors, and he was so inspired by it that it's actually the Toyota Serra that inspired Gordon Murray to put butterfly doors on the McLaren F1. Crazy to think that one of the biggest features on this $20 million plus supercar was inspired by a $10,000 Toyota hatchback. Next up, the Ford Mustang. Now, in the late 1980s, Ford was planning on bringing out the Gen 4 Mustang, replacing the Fox body, which at that point has been out for about 10 years or so, and paving the way for a new, aerodynamic, efficient Mustang for the future. And people hated it. Being front-wheel drive, having no V8, having pop-up headlights and a hatchback rear end, people hated this car as a Mustang. So much so that there was 5,000 handwritten letters sent to Ford of people saying, "I will not buy this. If you actually make it, you will kill the Mustang." And Ford listened. The Fox body went on to 1993, and the car they ended up building ended up turning into the Ford Probe. But the Gen 4 Mustang was supposed to be the Ford Probe. Next up, Tucker. Now, some of the younger audience might not know what Tucker is, so for them, here's some really obscure Tucker info. So when Tucker started building cars, their main goal was to build something so much better and so much more ahead than Ford, GM, or Dodge. And what they made was this full-size sedan that was rear-engined and rear-wheel drive, but had four-wheel disc brakes, more safety features in the interior, and actually a headlight in the middle that would turn along with the steering wheel. And unfortunately, due to a pile of lawsuits, Tucker ended up going bust, but they still made 50 cars. One car not many people knew about was a prototype they're working on that was nicknamed Vera. Now, Vera was a two-door Tucker convertible. Now, people debate if this is real or not, or if it was a hoax, because Tucker used every single production car they had to prove that they're a real company, not just stealing money. So the fact that Vera wasn't there for that made people debate if Vera was real or not. And it took like 60 years for people to actually realize that Vera's real, and it was actually a one-off prototype convertible that Tucker was building but just never finished. And now it's done, it's roadworthy, it actually pops up for sale every now and then, and it's super cool that A, not just it exists, but B, it's out driving around. One of one Tucker prototype. Next up, Shelby. Now, one of the things that Shelby is best known for is using Ford big blocks and Ford small blocks in their cars. But that wasn't supposed to be the case. Back in the early 60s, Chevy brought out a fuel-injected 5.3-liter V8 that was making 365 horsepower. Truly impressive numbers for an engine that was that small. So Carroll Shelby actually wanted to work with Chevy for engines for the Cobras. Chevy declined, Chevy didn't want to work with Shelby, so Shelby went to Ford. And we now have the legacy that Shelby and Ford have. But originally, that was supposed to be all Chevy engines. Next up, Nissan. Now in 2007, Nissan actually had a slot ready for a new car. And they had a couple of ideas, but they ended up narrowing it down to two. One of them being the Nissan Juke, and the other one being the S16 Silvia. And Nissan made the Nissan Juke.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Saying that people would actually like the Juke more than a new Silvia. Awful decision. What's funny is now the Juke's more or less dead, and Nissan's actually talking about now bringing back the S16 Silvia. But in 2010, 2009, Nissan actually had the opportunity to make an S16 Silvia. Next up, Koenigsegg. Now, we all know Koenigsegg. Koenigsegg's like one of the greatest supercar manufacturers on the planet right now. But back in the day, they had a car called the CCX. The CCX was kind of the first globally loved Koenigsegg that Koenigsegg actually made. And the CCX has a very funny experience on Top Gear. As the Stig was doing his power lap with the CCX, he actually went flying off one of the corners and put it right through a tire wall. Top Gear told Koenigsegg that this happened because there's no downforce in the rear end. It's just so slippery. As when some manufacturers would actually sue Top Gear over this, what Koenigsegg did was they brought the car back to the factory, fitted a spoiler for it, and then sent it back to Top Gear as, okay, now test it. And the CCX ended up being A, way more stable, B, the fastest car around their track for a long time. So Top Gear sort of actually helped form the future of Koenigsegg. Next up, the SVT Mustang. Now, Ford started making the SVT Cobra back in 1993, and since then there's been so many cool variants, mainly being the SVT Cobra R. But in 2002, whilst testing what was the new SVT Focus, what Ford discovered was the Focus was actually faster around their test track than the Mustang, which, Mustang at a premium, you can't have that. So what they decided to do is give the Mustang more power, give it an independent rear suspension, bigger brakes, more tire, and then sent it back out as the Terminator, being one of the best muscle cars we got in the early 2000s. But we only got that because the Ford Focus was actually better than the 0201 Mustang Cobras. Next up, the SL300 Mercedes. Now the SL300 Mercedes is like one of the earliest supercars to exist. And one of the things it's known for among anything else is having its gull-wing doors. But the gull-wing doors is actually just a mistake. You see, when Mercedes was designing the chassis for this, they actually didn't design anywhere they could safely bolt on doors, which is kind of important when you have doors on the car. But what they discovered was there was actually enough structural support on the roof where they could bolt the hinges above the driver and passenger and have gull-wing doors. So one of the coolest features of the SL300 was made by complete accident and oversight. Great mistake. Next up, the Mazda Miata. So the Mazda Miata came out in 1989 and it quickly became one of the fan favorite roadsters to ever be made to this day. But for the second generation Miata, Mazda actually made a hardtop coupe for it. Not a hardtop roadster, but a fixed hardtop coupe Mazda Miata. These things are super rare. They sold really poorly, and there's like 107 in existence. You are unlikely to see one, but Mazda did in fact make a coupe Miata in the 90s. Next up, the C5 Corvette. Now, C5 Corvette was made from 1997 to 2004, and we know it as the last Corvette that had pop-up headlights. But what are the rules that now exist? For a mass production car, you cannot have headlights or taillights on any sort of moving piece of bodywork. And way before that rule even came up, a lot of companies bailed out of it. The last three cars to use it was the C5 Corvette, the Lotus Esprit, and the Ferrari 456 GT. But the last one of those cars to exist was the C5 Corvette, making the C5 Corvette the last car ever to have pop-up headlights. Next up, Chrysler. Now in the Daimler Chrysler era, Chrysler worked really closely with Mercedes, obviously. And one of the cars Chrysler made using the base of a V12 Mercedes engine was the Mi412, which I've been calling the Mi412 for like 15 years. And it was a 850 horsepower quad turbo V12 monster that Chrysler was actually planning on putting in production. They built two, one show car, one test development car, and the plan was to make about 300 cars in total. But one of the rules Chrysler signed on to with Mercedes was nothing Chrysler made could be faster than what Mercedes was making. So instead of Mercedes using Chrysler for development purposes and making this incredible supercar that they could use that technology and put into their own cars, they canceled the Mi412 and it never came out because ego. Shame. And the last one we're going to talk about is Ford. Now, in 1969, Dodge and Plymouth brought out the Superbird and the Daytona, and these things were killing it in NASCAR. The Aero Car program was an absolute hit, and they were so much faster than everyone else. And Ford couldn't have that. So in 1970, Ford brought out a car they called the King Cobra. The King Cobra is going to be Ford's Aero car. It was a Ford Torino fastback fitted with a front end that looks like it came off a Datsun, and it was be way more aerodynamic and something to truly compete with Dodge. Unfortunately, at the end of 1970, the Aero cars were banned. Ford couldn't actually make it. Ford bailed out of racing altogether at the end of 1970, and they only made like 6 King Cobra Torinos. But Ford did actually go make their own Aero car for NASCAR. So that is 20 kind of weird car facts you may or may not know, but I want to know, what do you think? Did any of these kind of catch your eye as things you didn't actually know? And did you enjoy the video? Because if you did, I'll make another one. It was really fun to put together. So let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. Like, subscribe, enjoy what you've seen. I tend to post 3 times a week, and I'll see you later.